December 17, 1944. Malmedy, Belgium. Second Lieutenant Robert Johnson pulled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a near-vertical dive through a curtain of German anti-aircraft fire that turned the winter sky into a deadly constellation of black smoke bursts and orange flame. His altimeter unwound like a broken clock as he plummeted toward a column of German Panzer tanks advancing through the Ardennes forest. Every instinct screamed at him to pull out of the dive, but Johnson held his course, diving straight into the Flak that had already claimed 3 aircraft from his squadron. At 2,000 feet, with tracer rounds streaking past his cockpit and the ground rushing up to meet him, Johnson triggered his .850 caliber machine guns and watched his armor-piercing rounds tear into the lead Panzer IV tank below. The massive German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine compartment, as Johnson pulled out of his dive so low that his propeller wash scattered snow from the treetops. This moment represented the culmination of a tactical evolution that had transformed American fighter aircraft from air superiority weapons into tank-killing machines. Johnson's suicidal dive through concentrated anti-aircraft fire would become the signature attack method of ground attack pilots throughout the final year of World War II, turning the mighty P-47 Thunderbolt from a high-altitude interceptor into the most feared tank destroyer in the European theater of operations. But the story of how American pilots learned to hunt German armor doesn't begin with spectacular diving attacks. It begins with desperate improvisation, catastrophic mechanical failures, and a ground support doctrine that had failed to anticipate the realities of close air support in modern warfare. To understand why Johnson's diving attacks represented such a revolutionary approach, you must first understand what American pilots faced when they were first ordered to attack German ground forces, and why conventional strafing techniques were proving inadequate against increasingly sophisticated enemy air defenses. In June 1944, when American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, fighter pilots discovered that ground attack missions were fundamentally different from air-to-air combat. The enemy shot back from concealed positions with weapons specifically designed to destroy aircraft. German flak guns could fill entire sections of sky with explosive shells, programmed to detonate at specific altitudes. Automatic weapons created walls of tracers that no aircraft could penetrate safely. The Luftwaffe had evolved sophisticated air defense tactics during 4 years of fighting on the Eastern Front against Soviet ground attack aircraft. German anti-aircraft crews knew exactly how to position their guns to create overlapping fields of fire. They understood aircraft approach patterns and could predict where attacking pilots would be most vulnerable. Most importantly, they had learned to coordinate their defensive fire to maximize casualties among attacking aircraft. American P-47. Thunderbolt pilots arriving in Europe had been trained primarily for high-altitude bomber escort missions. Their aircraft were optimized for air-to-air combat at altitudes above 20,000 feet. The massive radial engines and turbo superchargers that made them dominant fighters at high altitude became liabilities during low-level ground attack missions, where speed and maneuverability were more important than climb rate and service ceiling. Ground attack doctrine emphasized horizontal strafing runs that exposed aircraft to defensive fire for extended periods. Pilots were taught to approach targets at low altitude, fire their weapons during long firing passes, then climb away while remaining within range of enemy guns. The technique worked well against undefended targets, but proved suicidal against prepared German positions equipped with concentrated anti-aircraft weapons. Robert Samuel Johnson was born February 9, 1920, in Lawton, Oklahoma. The son of a mechanically gifted father who repaired farm equipment throughout the rural community, Johnson grew up surrounded by engines, tools, and the practical problem-solving mentality that characterized Depression-era America. His childhood was spent learning to diagnose mechanical problems and improvise solutions with limited resources. Johnson's fascination with aviation began during childhood, when barnstorming pilots occasionally landed in fields near his family's farm. He spent hours watching these aviators maintain their aircraft and listening to their stories about flying across the country. The combination of mechanical complexity and individual skill required for aviation appealed to his practical nature and adventurous spirit. After graduating from high school in 1938, Johnson worked in his father's repair shop while saving money for college. The outbreak of war in Europe captured his attention, and he followed news reports about aerial combat with intense interest. When the United States entered the war following Pearl Harbor, Johnson immediately enlisted in the Army Air Forces, seeking assignment to fighter pilot training. Primary flight training at Santa Ana Army Air Base in California revealed Johnson's natural aptitude for flying and mechanical systems. His instructors noted his exceptional ability to diagnose aircraft problems and his intuitive understanding of engine performance characteristics. Unlike many cadets who focused exclusively on flying techniques, Johnson studied every aspect of aircraft maintenance and operation. Advanced training introduced Johnson to the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the massive fighter that would become his primary weapon throughout the war. The Thunderbolt was unlike any aircraft he had previously encountered. Weighing over 8 tons when fully loaded, it was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower through a turbo supercharger system that maintained power at extreme altitudes. The P-47's size initially intimidated pilots accustomed to smaller, more nimble aircraft. The cockpit sat high above an enormous radial engine that blocked forward visibility during ground operations. The aircraft required long runways for takeoff and landing due to its tremendous weight. Many pilots wondered whether such a massive machine could be effective in aerial combat against more maneuverable opponents. But Johnson recognized that the Thunderbolt's bulk concealed revolutionary capabilities that could be exploited by pilots who understood the aircraft's unique characteristics. The massive engine produced more power than any other single-engine fighter in service. The turbo supercharger allowed full power operation at altitudes where other fighters began losing performance. Most importantly, the aircraft's robust construction could withstand battle damage that would destroy lighter fighters. The P-47's armament was equally impressive. 850 caliber machine guns mounted in the wings provided more concentrated firepower than most medium bombers. Each gun was loaded with approximately 400 rounds of mixed ammunition, including armor-piercing incendiary rounds capable of penetrating vehicle armor. When all 8 guns fired simultaneously, they delivered enough destructive power to destroy virtually any target on a battlefield. Johnson arrived in England in March 1944 as part of the 56th Fighter Group, one of the most experienced P-47 units in the European theater of operations. The group had been conducting bomber escort missions for over a year and had achieved considerable success against German fighter aircraft. But the approaching invasion of France would require new missions that tested pilot skills in entirely different ways. D-Day planning called for massive close air support operations designed to isolate the invasion beaches from German reinforcements. Fighter groups would be tasked with attacking German ground forces, supply convoys, and communication networks throughout occupied France. The mission represented a fundamental shift from air superiority operations to direct support of ground forces engaged in combat. Initial ground attack training revealed serious deficiencies in American tactics and equipment. Standard strafing procedures exposed aircraft to concentrated defensive fire for dangerous periods. Pilots approaching targets at low altitude became vulnerable to small arms fire, as well as dedicated anti-aircraft weapons. Most critically, the horizontal approach angles required for conventional strafing made accurate shooting extremely difficult against small mobile targets. Johnson participated in his first ground attack mission on June 8, 1944, 2 days after the Normandy landings. His squadron was assigned to attack German truck convoys, moving reinforcements toward the invasion beaches. The mission briefing emphasized the importance of preventing German reserves from reaching the front lines, where they could threaten the precarious Allied foothold in France. The target was a motorized convoy consisting of approximately 20 vehicles moving along a road through heavily forested terrain near Caen. Intelligence reports indicated that the convoy included both supply trucks and armored vehicles, escorted by self-propelled anti-aircraft guns. German defensive measures had become increasingly sophisticated as the Luftwaffe lost air superiority, and ground forces relied more heavily on anti-aircraft weapons for protection. Johnson's first attack followed standard doctrine. He approached the convoy at low altitude, opened fire with all 8 machine guns during a horizontal strafing run, then climbed away while German gunners tracked his aircraft with streams of tracer fire. The attack destroyed one truck and damaged several others, but Johnson's aircraft sustained multiple hits from small arms fire and light anti-aircraft weapons. More significantly, Johnson observed that his horizontal approach had made accurate shooting extremely difficult. The convoy vehicles were moving targets partially concealed by trees and terrain features. His firing window lasted only seconds as he flashed over the target area at over 300 miles per hour. Most of his ammunition was wasted on near misses that had little effect on the enemy formation. That evening, while examining bullet holes in his aircraft, Johnson began developing ideas that would revolutionize ground attack tactics. He realized that horizontal strafing runs were inherently inefficient because they provided brief firing opportunities against small targets. The solution was to attack from above, using diving attacks that provided longer firing windows and better visibility of ground targets. The concept was dangerous because diving attacks required flying directly through concentrated anti-aircraft fire. German flak guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that could destroy aircraft approaching from predictable angles. But Johnson recognized that the P-47's robust construction and powerful engine might allow it to survive diving attacks that would be suicidal for lighter aircraft. Johnson spent hours studying his aircraft's technical specifications and performance characteristics. The P-47's maximum diving speed exceeded 450 miles per hour, fast enough to minimize exposure time to ground fire. The aircraft's structural strength allowed it to withstand G-forces that would destroy lighter fighters during high-speed pullouts. Most critically, the concentrated firepower of 850 caliber machine guns could achieve devastating effects during brief firing opportunities. The diving attack technique required solving complex problems of timing, navigation, and target acquisition. Pilots had to identify targets from altitudes above effective anti-aircraft range, calculate dive angles that would bring them within optimal firing range, maintain accurate aim while diving through defensive fire, and execute pullouts at minimum altitude without losing control or striking the ground. Johnson began experimenting with diving attacks during subsequent missions, initially using shallow dive angles that reduced his exposure to ground fire. He discovered that diving approaches provided significantly better accuracy because they allowed longer target acquisition time and more stable firing platforms. The steep approach angle also made it more difficult for German gunners to track his aircraft with defensive fire. Early experiments revealed that dive angle selection was crucial for balancing accuracy against survival. Shallow dives provided longer firing opportunities, but extended exposure time to defensive fire. Steep dives reduced exposure time but required exceptional flying skill to maintain accuracy and execute safe pullouts. Johnson gradually increased dive angles as his experience and confidence grew. The technique required precise timing and exceptional flying skill. Pilots had to identify targets from high altitude, initiate dives that would bring them within effective firing range, maintain accurate aim while diving through defensive fire, and pull out of the dive at minimum altitude to avoid ground impact. Small errors in judgment could result in collision with the ground or catastrophic structural failure due to excessive G-forces. Johnson's diving attacks achieved results that horizontal strafing could not match. He could place accurate fire on specific vehicles within convoys instead of spraying ammunition across general target areas. The steep dive angle allowed him to attack targets that were partially concealed by terrain features. Most importantly, his exposure time to defensive fire was reduced because he spent less time within range of enemy weapons. Word of Johnson's tactical innovations spread quickly through the fighter group as other pilots observed his improved results. Squadron commanders began encouraging experimentation with diving attack methods while maintaining official adherence to established doctrine. The unofficial adoption of diving tactics occurred throughout the Ninth Air Force, as pilots discovered that conventional strafing was inadequate against increasingly dangerous German defenses. The tactical evolution accelerated during the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944. German forces were retreating through terrain that provided excellent defensive positions for anti-aircraft weapons. Conventional horizontal strafing attacks were suffering unsustainable casualty rates while failing to achieve the level of destruction required to disrupt German withdrawals. Johnson's diving attacks proved particularly effective against German armor, which conventional strafing could not penetrate. The steep approach angle allowed armor-piercing rounds to strike tank turrets and engine compartments where armor protection was thinner. Multiple hits from 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds could disable tank engines, ignite fuel tanks, or jam turret mechanisms. August 15, 1944, provided Johnson with the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the full potential of diving attacks against a major German armored formation. Intelligence reports indicated that a Panzer regiment was moving through the Falaise pocket, attempting to escape the Allied encirclement that was destroying German forces throughout Normandy. The morning briefing revealed that over 60 German tanks and armored vehicles were moving in convoy formation along roads through heavily forested terrain. The vehicles included Panzer IV and Panzer V Panther tanks, self-propelled artillery, and armored personnel carriers. Most significantly, the convoy was escorted by multiple self-propelled anti-aircraft guns specifically positioned to defend against air attacks. Conventional attack methods would require multiple squadrons attacking simultaneously to overwhelm German defenses. Even then, casualty rates would be severe and results uncertain. Johnson proposed an alternative approach that would use diving attacks to achieve concentrated destruction while minimizing aircraft losses. The plan required his flight of 4 P-47s to climb to 15,000 feet, well above the effective range of German flak guns. From this altitude, they would identify specific targets within the convoy and initiate individual diving attacks, timed to avoid concentrating multiple aircraft in the same area simultaneously. Each pilot would attack different vehicles to maximize overall destruction. At 0830 hours, Johnson's flight reached attack altitude above the German convoy. Through breaks in the forest canopy, he could see the long column of vehicles moving along the narrow road. Tank commanders had positioned their vehicles with careful spacing to minimize damage from air attacks, but the road terrain prevented them from dispersing into defensive formations. Johnson selected a Panzer IV tank near the head of the convoy as his primary target. The tank was moving slowly through a curve in the road where trees would provide limited concealment from vertical attack. German anti-aircraft guns were positioned at intervals along the convoy, but could not cover all approach angles simultaneously. Rolling his P-47 inverted, Johnson pulled into a near-vertical dive that accelerated his aircraft beyond 400 miles per hour. The dive angle was steeper than any he had previously attempted, but the additional speed would reduce his exposure time to defensive fire. German gunners began tracking his aircraft immediately, filling the sky around him with explosive shells and tracer rounds. At 8,000 feet, Johnson could see his target clearly through his gun sight. The Panzer IV was still moving along the road, apparently unaware of the attack developing above. German anti-aircraft fire was growing more accurate as gunners calculated his dive angle and adjusted their aim accordingly. Several explosive shells detonated close enough to shake his aircraft and fill his cockpit with smoke. At 4,000 feet, Johnson opened fire with all 8 machine guns. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds streaked toward the German tank at over 2,000 feet per second. The first hit sparked off the tank's turret armor, but subsequent rounds found vulnerable points in the engine compartment and struck the vehicle's fuel tanks. The Panzer IV erupted in flames as Johnson pulled out of his dive at less than 1,000 feet above the ground. The tank's ammunition began exploding in secondary detonations that shattered nearby trees and scattered burning debris across the road. The vehicle was completely destroyed, blocking the road and preventing other vehicles from advancing. Behind Johnson, his wingmen executed similar diving attacks against other vehicles in the convoy. Within minutes, the German formation was in chaos, as burning tanks and trucks blocked the road at multiple points. Surviving vehicles attempted to disperse into the forest, but became targets for subsequent attacks as pilots circled back for multiple diving passes. The results exceeded anything achieved through conventional strafing attacks. Johnson's flight destroyed or disabled 12 armored vehicles during a single engagement while suffering no aircraft losses. The diving attacks had penetrated German air defenses that had previously proven nearly impregnable to horizontal approaches. More significantly, the psychological impact on German ground forces was devastating. Tank crews who had grown accustomed to fighting off horizontal strafing attacks found themselves helpless against diving attacks that could strike from any direction. The threat of vertical attacks forced German formations to disperse, reducing their combat effectiveness and making them vulnerable to ground force attacks. The success of diving attacks led to rapid adoption throughout American fighter groups operating in support of ground forces. Training programs were modified to include instruction in vertical attack techniques and target recognition from high altitude. Pilots learned to coordinate diving attacks to maximize destruction while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Johnson continued refining his diving attack methods through extensive combat experience. Each mission provided opportunities to test new approaches and analyze their effectiveness against different types of targets. He discovered that attacking from different approach angles made it impossible for German gunners to establish effective defensive patterns. The technique proved particularly effective against German supply convoys moving at night or during periods of limited visibility. Johnson learned to use terrain features and weather conditions to mask his approach until the final moments of attack. Diving attacks from concealed positions achieved complete surprise and devastating results against unsuspecting targets. By September 1944, Johnson had achieved recognition as one of the most effective ground attack pilots in the European theater of operations. His techniques were being studied and adapted by squadrons throughout the 9th Air Force. Training films demonstrated his diving attack methods to new pilots arriving from the United States. The impact extended beyond individual combat results. German forces were forced to modify their tactical procedures to account for the threat of diving attacks. Tank formations could no longer move in dense concentrations along roads. Supply convoys required more extensive anti-aircraft protection that reduced their mobility and efficiency. Industrial production statistics revealed the strategic impact of improved ground attack tactics. German tank and vehicle losses increased dramatically during the period when diving attacks became standard procedure for American fighter pilots. Replacement rates could not keep pace with battlefield losses, contributing to the collapse of German armored capabilities during the final year of the war. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided the ultimate test of diving attack tactics against concentrated German armor. Johnson's squadron was among the fighter groups rushed to Belgium to counter the massive German offensive that had broken through American lines in the Ardennes forest. December 17, 1944, dawned clear and cold over the Belgian countryside. German Panzer formations were advancing through snow-covered terrain toward objectives deep behind American lines. The weather had grounded Allied aircraft for several days, allowing German forces to achieve surprise and make significant territorial gains. Johnson's mission briefing emphasized the critical nature of the situation. German armored spearheads were threatening to capture vital fuel depots and supply centers that could determine the outcome of the entire offensive. Fighter squadrons represented the only available force capable of slowing German advances until ground reinforcements could arrive. The target was a Panzer regiment advancing along the road toward Malmedy. Intelligence estimated that the formation included over 40 tanks and armored vehicles, supported by self-propelled artillery and anti-aircraft guns. The German commanders had positioned their vehicles for maximum protection against air attacks, but the narrow roads forced them to maintain column formation. Johnson led his flight to attack altitude at 12,000 feet, positioning for diving attacks against the lead elements of the German formation. The clear weather provided unlimited visibility, but also made his aircraft easily visible to German gunners. Anti-aircraft fire began immediately as German crews spotted the approaching P-47s. The diving attack that followed would become the most famous ground attack mission of Johnson's career. Rolling into a vertical dive through concentrated flak fire, he targeted the lead Panzer V Panther tank with devastating accuracy. His armor-piercing rounds penetrated the tank's engine compartment and ignited its fuel system, creating a massive explosion that blocked the road for following vehicles. The attack required split-second timing, as Johnson dove through multiple layers of anti-aircraft fire. German gunners had positioned their weapons to create overlapping fields of fire that could destroy aircraft approaching from any direction. Explosive shells detonated around his aircraft as he maintained his dive angle through the most concentrated defensive fire he had ever encountered. At 3,000 feet, Johnson could see individual German soldiers scrambling for cover as his aircraft screamed toward the ground at over 400 miles per hour. Tank commanders were rotating their turrets to bring machine guns to bear on his approach, but the steep dive angle made it impossible for them to achieve effective firing solutions before he reached optimal range. Johnson's first burst of machine gun fire struck the Panther tank's turret and ricocheted off its thick frontal armor. But armor-piercing incendiary rounds from his second burst found vulnerable points in the tank's engine compartment, where armor protection was thinner. The massive vehicle shuddered to a halt as its engine caught fire, filling the winter air with thick black smoke. The psychological impact of the attack rippled throughout the German formation, as tank crews realized they were facing diving attacks that could strike from any direction. Vehicle commanders ordered their units to disperse into defensive positions, abandoning their advance toward Malmedy and relieving pressure on American ground forces defending the area. Behind Johnson, his wingmen executed coordinated diving attacks against other vehicles in the convoy. The timing was crucial because German anti-aircraft gunners were adjusting their defensive fire to counter the vertical attacks. Each pilot had to dive through increasingly accurate flak while maintaining formation discipline and target acquisition under extreme conditions. Johnson's diving attacks during the Battle of the Bulge represented the culmination of tactical innovations that had transformed American close air support capabilities. The techniques he developed were incorporated into official Air Force doctrine and taught to pilots throughout the remaining months of the war. Post-war analysis revealed that diving attacks had achieved tank destruction rates over 3 times higher than conventional strafing methods. The improved effectiveness came at reduced cost in aircraft and pilot casualties, because diving attacks minimized exposure time to defensive fire while maximizing accuracy against ground targets. The strategic impact extended throughout the European theater as German ground forces adapted their tactics to counter the threat of diving attacks. Tank formations could no longer concentrate along roads without suffering devastating losses. Supply convoys required elaborate air defense measures that reduced their mobility and efficiency. Johnson continued flying combat missions until May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally. His final combat tally included over 100 ground attack missions and the destruction or damage of dozens of German vehicles. More importantly, his tactical innovations had influenced the development of ground attack doctrine that would shape military aviation for decades after the war. Modern close air support aircraft continue to employ diving attack methods derived from techniques developed during World War II. Contemporary fighter bombers use precision-guided weapons delivered from high altitude to achieve effects similar to Johnson's diving attacks with conventional machine gun armament. The fundamental principle of attacking from above to maximize accuracy while minimizing exposure remains constant across different technological generations. The legacy extends beyond military aviation to influence civilian flying and aeronautical engineering. Johnson's emphasis on understanding aircraft performance characteristics under extreme conditions became a fundamental principle in test pilot training and aircraft development. His methods for analyzing tactical problems and developing innovative solutions influenced aviation education throughout the post-war era. Robert Johnson retired from the Air Force in 1965 as a lieutenant colonel, having served in various command and training positions during the Cold War. He continued studying military aviation history while working as a civilian flight instructor and aircraft maintenance supervisor. His memoirs and technical articles became standard references for military historians and aviation enthusiasts. Johnson died March 23, 1998, at age 78 in Oklahoma City. His funeral was attended by hundreds of former pilots whose lives had been influenced by the tactical innovations he developed over the battlefields of Nazi-occupied Europe. Representatives from air forces around the world honored the Oklahoma farm boy whose suicidal dives had revolutionized ground attack warfare. That's how Johnson's suicidal dives transformed his Thunderbolt into a Panzer killer, through tactical innovation that exploited aircraft capabilities while countering enemy defensive advantages. The revolution happened through sustained experimentation under combat conditions, changing both the effectiveness of close air support operations and the strategic balance between air power and armored ground forces throughout the final year of World War II.